You'll often hear people saying that since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was caused by sinas chinam, baseless hatred, therefore, in order for us to recover, be redeemed, and reclaim the Beis Hamikdash, we should rectify the sin of sinas chinam. Sometimes you'll hear people say we should replace sinas chinam with avas chinam, baseless hatred with baseless love. And I think there are a few errors in this which it's worth exploring. But there's also something deep here which may actually justify it. I was always very bothered by this kind of argument because it's seems to be very short-sighted. A little history. What's this based on, this idea of sinas chinam being the root of all our problems? It's, of course, the Gemara in Yuma, Daf Teshuva Beis, that says that the cause for the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash was the Aveira of sinas chinam. Now, that same Gemara tells us that the cause for the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash was Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shfichus Damim. The three cardinal sins: idolatry, incest, and murder. And if you look at the Nevi'im, you'd be forgiven for assuming, you'd be justified in assuming that of the three, the main one is the first, idolatry. Now, when people say, okay, we have to rectify sinas chinam, they're thinking of course, of the Bayis Sheni. Why are they thinking of the Bayis Sheni? Because the way they think is, look, whatever we did wrong in Bayis Rishon, we've rectified or we've recovered from that because we came back, we got the Bayis Sheni. And now we have to retrieve what we lost, which is Bayis Sheni, and we lost it because of sinas chinam. But this is, stated that way, is an error. It's a wrong way of thinking about it because we never fully recovered what we lost at the destruction of Bayis Rishon. And there are a few different ways to express this, all related to the same point. One way to express it is Nevuah didn't return. The Shechina wasn't Shoyra in Bayis Sheni, the way the Gemara in Yuma on the same page, Daf Teshuva Beis puts it. Shechina was not Shoyra in Bayis Sheni. So whatever the sins of Bayis Rishon led to was never reversed in full. It's only reversed partially. Another way to point out this, to state this really the same issue, is that in the Bayis Shenis, in the redemption which led to Bayis Sheni, which we can barely call a redemption, as we shall soon see, we didn't have autonomy. We were under the sovereignty under the rule of the Persian Empire, unlike the first temple. And another thing to point to is the Gemara that says, Ad Ya'avar Amcha Hashem, Ad Ya'avar Amzu Kanisa. The pasuk twice talks about Bnei Yisrael entering Eretz Yisrael, and the fact that it says it twice indicates that the second coming, that is to say, the coming back to Eretz Yisrael in the days of Ezra, could have been and should have been as miraculous as the first one in the days of Yeshua. Ela shegar machet. But the sin caused it to not be as miraculous, which tells us that the return in the days of Ezra was incomplete, insufficient, did not live up to its potential, and did not live up to even the comparison with the first entry into Eretz Yisrael in the days of Yeshua. And these are 3 points that revolve all around the same thing. It could have been miraculous. We could have had sovereignty, but we didn't. We didn't have the Hashras HaShechina. We didn't have the Shechina dwelling in the bias or the return of, or the continuation of Nevuah, prophecy. Rashi in Yeshaya, I think it's Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Yud Aleph, the Pasuk says Hashem will redeem his people Shenis. Yosef Hashem Ligol Shenis. He will be goyal, he will redeem a second time. And Rashi says, why a second time? Why not a third time? We already redeemed twice. He says, no, the second time doesn't count. The second time was not considered a geula. We are still in the first galus. So Chaste Kreskes Ner Hashem says it even more clearly, the whole piece. And he asks the following questions. As people ask, why did the sins of the first temple lead to a 70-year exile? And the sins of the second temple lead to this endless exile. And he says the question's a mistake because we are still suffering for the sins of the first temple. The second Beis HaMikdash was this temporary reprieve, although we were not redeemed, although we did not rectify the root causes of the loss of prophecy and loss of sovereignty in Israel. Although we did not rectify that, nonetheless, we had a partial reprieve where we had a kind of ingathering back to the land of Eretz Yisrael, a permission to live there as a Jewish community, but of course under the rule of the Persians. And says of Chaste Kreskas, continues and says, obviously that kind of existence, if there's going to be sinas chinam, if we're not going to get along, we're not going to be able to maintain that kind of gift, that delicate gift of living in Eretz Yisrael, having a Beis HaMikdash while being under foreign power. So we lost it, and now we're back to where we started before the Bayis Sheni. That is, we're still suffering for the sins of Avodah Zarah, Gila V'Ashvichas Dam. Now, you might be thinking, we're still suffering for Avodah Zarah. Didn't we? We don't do Avodah Zarah. And in fact, in Bayis Sheni, there was no record of them doing Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara in Yuma says, and in Sanhedrin, that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah annulled the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah. So we don't do Avodah Zarah anymore. So what I want to tell you is, what I want to discuss a little bit in brief, is how is it that we don't do Avodah Zarah, and yet we're still suffering from Avodah Zarah, and why there is a connection between that and sinas chinam, and it may justify people's focus on sinas chinam. But we're up to at this point is this statement that everyone says, okay, sinas chinam is our problem, that's what we have to rectify. It's in and of itself, it's an incomplete analysis of our problem. Our problem is we're trying to get back to Nevuah, back to what Chazal called 1,000 years that Klal Yisrael had under Hashem, the Midrashim called it that. 1,000 years that ended in the, we'll call it at the end of Bayis Rishon, for our purposes, we can call it that. Technically, it's 40 years into the Bayis Sheni, which is the end of Nevuah. Yehuda Levi says that was a holdover from Bayis Rishon, those 40 years of Nevuah. So that's what we're trying to retrieve, and of course, I want to just point out, when we say retrieve, I don't think we're supposed to turn back the clock. There is no turning back the clock. But we're supposed to gain something that has that kind of Das Hashem, has that kind of Nevuah, in a way that's been changed and improved and influenced and rectified without its problems through the process of exile. That happens to be the subject, essentially, of my whole book project, Exodus, Exile, and Redemption, on my Substack. But at the minimum, we can say this. We don't want to build another Bayis Sheni. Maybe we will if we could. In my opinion, that's why we have Masechtas Midas, because if we have the opportunity to build another Bayis without Mashiach, without revelation, without Yechezkel Hanavi's Bayis being the one that we should build, we can build the one in Masechtas Midas, and we should build the one from Masechtas Midas. But that's not what we're yearning for. And there's two criticisms here. First of all, why talk about sinas chinam as if we're yearning for Bayis Sheni? It's not what we're yearning for. But secondly, and deeper still, when people say, okay, sinas chinam was our problem, therefore that's what we have to rectify, they're thinking about it not in terms of a practical matter, right? If someone says, look, here are the problems with the Jews, here's what we have to rectify, he's not calling Gemaras, he's not talking about Midrashim, he's just talking about the reality. Fine, respect. But when a person calls on the Gemara and says, look, the Gemara says sinas chinam is our problem, so therefore, that's what we have to rectify. What he's doing is he thinks he has a window into the ways of Hashem, because the Gemara gives us that window. And because he has a window into the ways of Hashem, he knows what we have to fix. But that's not true in this case. Why? Because since the ways of Hashem are really revolve around Avodah Zarah Gila V'Ashvichas Dam, that's really that was our real problem why we lost Shechina. And like I said from Chaste Kreskas, this is the loss of Bayis Sheni was due to Sinaschina was simply that we can't hold on to a bias. We can't hold on to this um, delicate kind of semi-rule in the state of Israel while we're under the country, the land of Eretz Yisrael, while we're under foreign dominion, unless we're very unified. So then to say, okay, therefore that means that we're thinking about the ways of Hashem, that's what we have to rectify, is obviously not true, because that's not built into the plan of Hashem. That's not what Klal Yisrael is about. Klal Yisrael is about not doing avodah zarah. That's our relationship to Hashem is revolves around that, and mainly not doing avodah zarah, idolatry, the first of those three, and we're going to focus on that. So that's the main thing. That's what the Nevi'im are about. That's what Torah is about. Don't serve other gods, etc. So then to shift it down to Sinaschina, by virtue of the fact that the Gemara tells us that's what it's about, and therefore we think we know the ways of Hashem, it's a big mistake, because that's not the plan of Hashem. That's not the structure of the relationship between Hashem and Yisrael. It does not revolve around Sinaschina. It revolves around not doing avodah zarah. And of course, again, I think a lot of this is because what else should people talk about on Teshuva? Not doing avodah zarah. We don't do avodah zarah. So what's the problem? It gets back to that problem I was saying before, that to say that, well, we have to go back to Bayis Rishon. Okay, well, what should we do? Not kill each other? Not do incest? Not do idolatry? We're pretty good with that. I think we really are, 100%. I'm not claiming we're not. So what's going on here? So I want to explain to you in what sense avodah zarah is still something that we have a problem with, and B, in what sense that may actually does connect to Sinaschina. So first of all, I want to tell you an amazing Rashi. I don't recall off the top of my head where it is, but I mentioned earlier that the Gemara says that had they been worthy of it, they would have had a miraculous return in the days of Ezra to Eretz Yisrael, like they had in the days of Yeshua. But the sin caused Garam HaChet. So what was the sin? So there's Rashis about this in various places, because this is mentioned in the Gemara Sotah, in the Gemara Sanhedrin, and it's also in Brachas. And there's Rashi in Yechezkel about it. And in one of those places, I don't recall off the top of my head which one, he says, when he's treating of what was the chet, okay, what chet? What was the problem that caused them not to have full redemption? So he says the chet was that they did avodah zarah in Bayis Rishon. Okay. The devil is on Bayis Rishon. And why are they suffering? And why do they suffer because of avodah zarah in Bayis Rishon? Didn't they do tshuva? They stopped doing avodah zarah. So Rashi says they didn't do tshuva hagenes amanash le'lachte. They didn't do a proper tshuva planning or with intention not to sin. And this is a very interesting expression. How can a person do tshuva without planning not to sin? Can you do tshuva amanas lachtoi? Can a person do tshuva still planning on sinning? What does Rashi mean that they didn't do a proper tshuva with intention not to sin? They did tshuva with intention to sin. How does one do that? The answer is like this. What was the nature of the tshuva? The Gemara says in Yuma and Sanhedrin that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah were mevatel the yetzer avodah zarah. They annulled the yetzer avodah zarah. So once upon a time there was an inclination to avodah zarah, and the Anshe Knesset Gedolah brought it to an end. And what that means is, and I've been discussing this recently in my Exorcism and Redemption. I think it's some of the previous chapters, the recent chapters. What this means is as follows. Why was there an inclination to idolatry back in the day? Because there was a sense that God is present. There was a sense that God is present. Hashem, God, the God, that he was manifest in your daily life, in your daily experience. And by the way, that's the sense that the Nevi'im talk about. This is happening because you deserve it. You did this wrong, therefore this is the result. Obviously, v'hayim shemaya. If you do the mitzvahs, it will rain. If you don't, it doesn't. So Hashem is manifest. He's present in your daily life. You understand what happens to you in light of your relationship with Hashem. So you can relate to Hashem. He's near. He's karev. He's almost tangible. And because he's almost tangible, there's a big risk, which is that if you misunderstand Hashem, if you want to bring Hashem to be relatable in something very close, very near, then you make him tangible. So that's in a nutshell. That's in a very small nutshell, stating the relationship between the inclination to idolatry and prophecy. The Gra says in Seder Olam that when they annulled the Yitzhak avodah zarah, prophecy ended too, because what that means is like this. That means is that there was a shift in the psyche, human psyche, whereas once upon a time people would seek divinity and expect to find divinity present and near. And like I said, present and near could mean either Hashem, who's abstract but present in his actions. But if you really then, if you go off a little bit and you say, no, he's near and he's here, then he becomes a piece of wood, something tangible, something really relatable, and then you slip into idolatry. So it was the same passion, but it's that same passion which leads a person to do idolatry, because he has a passion for a connection with the divine, which leads, when properly directed, to prophecy. When they brought that to an end, bringing that to an end means they encouraged people to stop thinking about the divine in this kind of present, manifest way, but rather more in a, we can say, in an abstract, philosophical kind of way. The end of prophecy coincides with the beginning of the Greek Empire. No coincidence there. That's to say that it's a different kind of thinking, a different kind of mind, a different kind of relationship with the divine, which precludes both prophecy and idolatry. Now, it's all very nice to excise a piece of your mind, basically, or to excise, and you have to think about this, like, what does it mean for a person who was once upon a time on fire with this idea of Hashem being manifest? You have to think about it, let yourself consider what it means. We sort of not used to thinking that way for good reason, because this is exactly what Ashkenazi don't want us to do. They want it to be more abstract. Parenthetically, you can argue that Hasidus is trying to turn back the clock on this and bring back Nevuah and bring back some of that passion, along with its dangers. Maybe it's time to re-engage, okay? But assuming that Knesset Gedolah establish a kind of relationship with Hashem, where Hashem is kept in a certain sense at arm's length, in a safe distance, we can call it. Therefore, you're not liable to slip into Avodah Zarah. That's what they did, and that's why this is a little bit foreign, because we're doing Judaism as the Anshe Knesset Gedolah encouraged and enacted. So basically, we did a kind of process of excising a part of our brains, and this is what Rashi calls tshuva haguna shloi amanas lachta. They did not do a tshuva haguna with intention not to sin. So what does that mean? What's a proper tshuva? What does the Gemara describe? Proper tshuva is when you're in the same circumstances and you don't do the sin again. That's a proper tshuva. Proper tshuva, when this person says, I can deal with the danger, I can deal with the problem, I can face it and not succumb and not fail. A tshuva that's not amanash leilachta is where a person says, actually, I know myself. Actually, I am not going to be able to withstand the temptation. So instead, I'm going to do some kind of operation on my psyche such that I never have to face that temptation again. Okay? And in this case, what they did was they made the allure of the divine. They took out of themselves the draw to this kind of direct, tangible, manifest relationship with the divine. Because they knew that if they have that in themselves, they're liable to do Avodah Zarah. They're not willing, they weren't able to face that and yet direct it to Hashem. Instead, they took that out of themselves. So now, it's a tshuva, and it's a tshuva that's going to work. But the reason why it's going to work so well is because it's not dealing directly with the sin. It's sort of avoiding confrontation with the sin, and it's changing yourself such that the sin becomes so absurd, and you can't even imagine why someone would do Avodah Zarah. Now I want to show you why this actually leads to sinas chinam, and we're going to get to why the argument that we should fix sinas chinam may conceal a very deep truth. Why was there baseless hatred in the bias sheni, not in the first bias? Why is baseless hatred a function? Why is it something that appears only in the second temple? Now we know. Back in the day, when there was one person who served Yud Ke Vav Ke and his neighbor served the Baal, and they were both passionate, they were both fully infused with their God and with the idea of their God. They hated each other. They would kill each other. They would fight with each other. Not bechinam. Not in a baseless, on the contrary. When a person has Das Hashem, nothing is baseless, nothing is chinam. His whole essence is infused with his Hashem, with Hashem. Nothing he does is chinam. Nothing he does is superficial. And neither is the guy who's infused with Baal and has a passionate relationship with Elohim Acherim, with whatever God he may worship. Ashtoris, Asherah. He's so afire with his God, and nothing he does is chinam. Everything is principled. Principled, I don't like the word principled, because principle itself is superficial. It's chinam. Everything he does is coming from his essence, from his self, from his real self, from what he is. When we cut out Das Hashem, when we cut out this kind of relationship with Hashem, that can make us be aflame with passion, and we don't face Hashem in the same way. What we did was, like I said before, we keep Hashem at arm's length. And now what happens is, we're still committed to the Torah, of course. It's the Torah. But we don't really know why in the same way that they used to. When they were still passionate about Hashem, then everything that they did came from their self, came from their true self. Nothing is chinam. But now when we ask the Jewish people, listen, we don't want you to go that close to Hashem. We don't want you to engage with Hashem that closely, that you could have prophecy and chas v'shalom if you mess up and up serving other gods. Better to avoid the whole thing. As the Gemara says, we don't want his reward of the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, nor its punishment. Okay. But you're still committed to the Torah. Now, of course, the Torah is all about this relationship with Hashem. We're asking you to be committed to something, even though it's not really you. That is to say, to have principles, to be committed to a document, to be committed to a set of principles that is not fully yourself, because nothing is fully you, because you're not allowing yourself to become enchanted with Hashem and to recognize that you have this possible relationship of closeness with Hashem. So you become more of a superficial person who's nonetheless, well, I shouldn't say nonetheless, because you're superficial, therefore you're committed to texts as texts instead of something that has the deepest meaning. And that is the recipe for sinas chinam, because sinas chinam means I hate someone and I don't even know why I hate him. And why do I not know why I hate someone? How could I hate someone not knowing why? Because I'm not a real person. I'm not an authentic person. I'm a chinam kind of person. I'm a superficial kind of person. Sinas chinam is a symptom of chinam. If you're a chinam person, you hate. Why? Because you have to. You have to. Because you don't know why you're committed to anything, really. But you know that you're supposed to be committed to something, right? So what do? You find something superficial that makes you different from your neighbor. And you say, that's what it's about. He's doing it different than me. So I hate him. Why do I hate him? Because he's doing something different? Because I don't even know what I'm doing. Because I don't even have Das Hashem. So therefore, I can't hate for good reason. I don't have good reasons. All I have is a lot of chinam piled on, more chinam. And I make systems out of that to pretend and assert that I have some true system. So now you see something very interesting. That although the first temple is about Avodah Zarah and the second temple is about baseless hatred, there's a direct line that connects them. And it's like this. It's like when a person has a problem. Let's say a person has a real problem in relationships or whatever. So there's two things he could do. One is he could actually face the problem and attempt to solve it, to cure it. Another thing he could do is to tell himself some lie or make something unnatural about him. And such that the problem, he doesn't have to face the problem. And you know what? That might work for the problem, but that's likely to generate new problems. That's exactly what happened. The way we chose to deal with Avodah Zarah generated a kind of chinam-ness within ourselves, such that now we become sinas chinam people. There's a very interesting Marsha in Sanhedrin. It's Daf, I don't remember exactly, Chaf, Chesam, Beis maybe. The Mishnah talks about relatives being pasal eidos, and then the Gemara goes into the pasuk that says Lo yumsu avos abanim, fathers can't be killed for their sons, etc. Okay, fine. And then the Gemara talks about the contradiction between ish becheto yumasu, each man dies only by his own sin, with the pasuk in the Torah that says va'af ba'avonos avosom itom yimaku, they die for their father's sins as well. And the Gemara says there's the difference between and not. If a son continues in the ways of his father, then he suffers for the sins of his fathers. But if he does not continue in the ways of his fathers, he starts anew, then he will not suffer for the sins of his fathers. The Marsha over there talks about that pasuk, and he points out that there's a shift in the Teichacha between second person to third person. And in that pasuk it says, "V'nisharim bachem yimaku b'avonam." Those who remain from you will rot in their sins. And also in the sins of the father, of their fathers, they will rot. So it starts off talking about you, and then it switches to third person, their fathers. So that's the Marsha, that the Teichacha is talking about Bayis Rishon, because it mentions Avodah Zarah. That was the main sin of the Bayis Rishon. So in Bayis Rishon, the difference between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, in Bayis Rishon, there was still Nevuah. Hashem was still talking to us directly. So therefore it says you. Bayis Sheni, there was no Nevuah. This second pasuk is talking about Bayis Sheni, and that's why it says Yimaku, they will rot, because it's referring to sinas chinam, which is like this rot in society, and that's the sin of the Bayis Sheni. Okay, that's what Masha says. But there's a problem here, because this pasuk says that they'll suffer for the sins of their fathers, and the Gemara says that's talking about when that the only time sons suffer for the sins of their fathers is when they are still doing like their fathers. Here in Bayis Sheni, they weren't doing Avodah Zarah. They were doing sinas chinam, as Masha points out. And yet the Masha says they suffer for the Avodah Zarah of their fathers. But I think, in light of what we discussed, it may be that sinas chinam is considered a continuation. And we could ask the question like this. Okay, we have this rule. A son suffers for his father's sins, but only if he continues them, not if he starts anew. What if he doesn't really deal with the problem? He finds a way to circumvent it, and that generates new problems. Is that called that he's doing the sins of his fathers? That's bidiyuk. That's exactly what was happening in Bayis Sheni. We had a problem with Avodah Zarah, and we dealt with it in a way that doesn't really deal with the root cause, and that generated a new set of problems. The new set of problems is sinas chinam type of people. So therefore, we are sort of still suffering psychically from the sins of the Bayis Rishon, and therefore perhaps we deserve to suffer materially as well. By the way, we do suffer materially, because idolatry leads to sinas chinam, leads to problems. So you don't even have to make it on a different level. Le'inyoneinu, I just want to end with saying that, going back to what we started with. So people say, okay, we have to rectify the sin of sinas chinam, and I always had a problem with that, which is that no, it's actually not about sinas chinam, it's actually about Avodah Zarah. But now we know that the two things are closely related, and perhaps the insistence of everyone that we should rectify the sinas chinam is really an insistence that we should become real people again. People who, if they mess up, will do Avodah Zarah. And of course, there is going to come a time where we have to face that, and we obviously have to understand, why did the Anshe Yisrael believe we cannot face it, and why would we be able to face it at some point? So there's always the question, is it time to bring back the Avodah Zarah? Something I think about a lot. When is the time for that, and how would that be done? But the call to end sinas chinam, I maintain, is not a call to end sin. And people say, don't do sinas chinam, do avos chinam. That I think is completely, that there's no basis. That makes no sense, because a chinam person hates. A person who has within himself chinamness is going to be a hater. Because if you're a chinam person, you have to, like I said before, you have to take a stand, because you don't believe anything. If you're not a chinam person, you're going to love, you're going to do the right thing. You'll hate, you'll hate those who should be hated, and you'll love those who should be loved, and that's great. And as long as you're a chinam person and you're not fully integrated with Das Hashem, you are going to naturally hate. Sinah is the outgrowth of chinam. So I don't think there's such a thing called avos chinam. I don't think it's a real thing. Of course, you can find isolated places for it, but it's got its own set of problems. At best, avos chinam will just create a new set of problems, okay? Like another Avera. Next step. Like, okay, with sinas chinam, we went to avos chinam, and that leads to some other Avera, became, I don't know what. You could imagine. Avos chinam people have their problems. Okay, I don't think that's the answer. But when people call to end sinas chinam, it's really a call not to be a chinam person. Not to be a chinam person is to be someone who is so alive with Das Hashem in the real way, and he doesn't do Avodah Zarah because he got it right. That's the real tikkun. And that will bring us back. That will bring us not back. That will bring us forward to the Geula Shalema B'Korov.